All right, well, I think we can begin. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to the Tallgrass Prairie Center Restoration and Management Spring Seminar Series. My name is Laura Jackson, and I'm director here of the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. We're welcoming our in-person guests tonight. Thank you for coming. You are the ones who get the cookies. And welcome also to those of you who joined us online. This session is being recorded and will be available online eventually once we get the captions added for hearing impaired. We can move to the next slide. Before introducing our guest speaker tonight, I have some people to thank. We'd like to thank all of the generous donors who've made this seminar series possible. Our seminar series is sponsored by the Friends of the Tallgrass Prairie Center. And we'd also like to thank the University of Northern Iowa 150th Celebration Committee. This is the 150th anniversary of UNI. And so there's a whole series of events going on this year that mark that date, and we are part of that celebration. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Olson, our guest speaker. Andy grew up in rural Iowa. It was either Hamilton or Wright County. He'll have to correct me. Rural Hamilton County. He earned his bachelor's degree in public history from UNI. And then he went on to get a master's degree in history, specializing in cultural resource management from Colorado State University. He then came back to Iowa and served as a Green Iowa AmeriCorps member here at the TPC. After that, we hired him. He was so wonderful. We hired him to be our Prairie on Farms program manager. He's currently living in Austin, Texas, and he's the stewardship specialist for the Native Prairies Association of Texas. And so please welcome me in join me in welcoming Andy Olson.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to assume my mic is coming through in the room as it was. Let me get this
Yes.
set up. And hopefully it's not my presenter view. You never know. I'm always nervous about that. So it's Hamilton County. And I went to community college to add all my school. I went to community college at Ellsworth, but I grew up near the town of Ellsworth to make it more complicated than ever before. So thank you for inviting me. I'm always amazed that Laura and everyone else at Tallgrass Prairie Center hasn't been like, let's not have that guy here anymore. Because they're so brilliant and a great resource, and I'm always amazed they hired me in the first place and put on me. So thank you. So tonight I want to talk about some of the native seed industry, sort of with this theme of persistence. Um, I guess I wanted to have the three P's. I think maybe resistance can be a better word, but in some ways, just want to be a celebration of these interesting people and share some, at the very least, share some interesting pictures and sources with you. So first, I want to start with a quote. Let me get it so I can see that. A quote, and it's not a talk I give if I don't have a long rambling quotes all the way throughout, so bear with me. Quote, 70 years ago, Lonesome Prairie had never been plowed. Every year it grew the wild prairie grasses and flowers. Blue stem, turkey's foot, grass, and Indian grass grew as high as a man on horseback. During the summer and fall, there were masses of gorgeous yellow flowers, brown-eyed Susans, wild sunflowers, goldenrod, and compass plants, dotted Lonesome Prairie with yellow splotches. Purple and white wild asters gave a little variety in the season. Early in the summer, lilies made reddish-brown spots, and wild phlox and windflowers gave a red and white mixture. This was in Wallace's Farmer magazine in 1915, and the picture I had pop up was on the same page as it. So it's titled Lonesome Prairie. Don't know where that's at. Don't know if it's real. I couldn't find it, but this is a common sentiment with the Tallgrass Prairie. It's a eulogy, right? It's something that's gone and really can't come back. But tonight, I want to talk about the people who have moved beyond this and they've done something about it. And I think the native seed industry is a great example of resistance in the face of adversity. And I also want to highlight that while the ecosystem itself is gone, rightfully so, and it is decimated, a lot of the plants persist, and we should be grateful for that, that we can still utilize them on our landscape and for their beauty and for all these different things for our entire planet, all the animals and that live there. Um, Another perspective I want to share is from J.E. Weaver. He primarily worked in Nebraska. He was a botanist and ecologist, I guess. And this was another quote he shared at the Ecological Society of America address in 1931. Quote, all of the prairie areas are disturbed, usually only by late annual mowing. To what extent, if any, they have been modified from the original grassland, which was both grazed and burned, cannot be determined. But their resistance to invaders, even when the area is entirely surrounded by them, shows in an impressive manner their high degree of stabilization and their wonderful adjustment to the environment. And further on, quote, that the prairies are making their last stand against the invader, man, cannot be overemphasized. Detached areas are even now often separated by many miles. Every year, some of these scattered relic outposts are yielding before the plow or being destroyed by intensive grazing, end quote. And again, it's persistence in the face of this degradation, but he decided to do something about it, study it, and really added a lot of knowledge to it. He has this massive book I've seen in Dr. Myson's office many times, talking about tallgrass prairie and all that stuff. So um, here he is up in the Palouse, cute little prairie ecosystem, looking at roots, and he has a lot of really cool designs. There's a cooler one; it's almost like 3D, but it's kind of hard on PowerPoint to see. Thought I'd just share this one. And then a little more of a general rundown. We already kind of touched on this. I'll touch a little bit more. Prairie at the turn of the 20th century, what it's kind of the landscape looked like. And then the Soil Conservation Service. We call it the NRCS today. We'll get into that a little bit. And then native seed use in the Dust Bowl. Origins of native seed growers and restoration ecology. Um, just real quickly, when I'm talking about native seed growers, I'm generally talking about businesses that are using native vegetation that they've either collected or received and growing it out to a high enough level where they can sell relatively in bulk seed to a consumer. And really the focus of this was on CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. So acres at a time, anywhere from, half an acre, 1 acre and up. I'm not more boutique nurseries for gardens and growing live plants and plugs to plant in the ground are a part of this as well. But it's a broad spectrum, but that's generally what I'm talking about. Background on some of those growers, Conservation Reserve Program, its relation with the farm crisis, and just, general background going on. So Conservation Service NRCS, and then what I call refinement of technical specifications and implementation, how that program's grown and how seed growers and the seed industry have adapted to it. And then I'll end with the pollinator program and impacts in the 2010s. So why is the Upper Midwest seemingly the leader in the native seed industry? From where I stand and what I've continued to find is that because the tallgrass prairie is the most destroyed ecosystem in the US, kind of what other option is there? So restoration is really focusing. From there, I think Iowa is a great place to focus because it's probably the most gone in that state. And even the upper Midwest states have some sort of other ecosystem to sort of turn to. You go north in Minnesota, you have woods, you have the Ozarks in Missouri, the Great Lakes region. So I think that's part of it. And again, just further, another person who's kind of doing something about it, the decline of the prairie. And this is from Iowa from 1901. Quote, the extensive prairies have given way to cultivated fields and pastures. Small unbroken areas occur here and there, but these are confined to small drainage basins between the hills and exist largely because in times of considerable precipitation, these depressions are too moist for proper cultivation. They sure did a good job about that over those 20 some odd years between quotes. All the drainage style continues today. A lot more wet areas there should be were drained close. Speaking of Hamilton County, there is a lake called Lost Lake because they completely drained it, and it was about 400 some odd acres. If you drove Highway 20 to, it's near where Highway 35 and Interstate 35 and Highway 20. Maybe I've been gone from Iowa too long. Converge right in there. So, and after they drained it, they grew potatoes because it's like peat, and now it's soy and corn beans and corn beans. That's a new one. Corn and soybeans and hog confinements. So his quote, this is where I kind of get this idea of persistence from Dr. Shemek, biologist in 1923. Flora survives, quote, in neglected corners, along fence rows, and partially pastured streams, and on more or less undisturbed open ground generally. And I don't have a quote from that, but he also talks about an abandoned field at that time and how the adjacent prairie ended up taking over some of the areas, which is really cool. Um, I think this persistence of prairies is connected to the persistence of people as well. Our culture, our economy has destroyed it. And this is a response to that, right? This is a way that we can sort of fight back, even in the face of a culture and economy built upon unlimited growth on a finite planet, right? Especially native seed industry is finding a way to fit into that economy and do something about it, right? And again, I think it's always important to remember, I'll talk a bit about the Great Plains, just that, the humid regions and the not so humid regions have different problems associated with the right. So I think if you look at Iowa, it's probably easier to grow a patch of big blue stem than it is in far western Nebraska, right? At least for a native seed grower to establish and sell a lot of seeds. So just because the rain is better. There's also a population aspect to it. More people live east of the 98th meridian than west of it, at least in the Great Plains and stuff. Um, Talking difference when we get far to the west coast, but so there's sort of this ecological necessity aspect stemming from agricultural intensification, right? And that only gets worse over time in the time period we're talking. Worse in some respects, just different in others. So, you know, no-till arrives on the scene. Maybe erosion goes down, but we have a whole new herbicide regime coming in its place, right? And like milkweed and the monarch, not good for that. So. I start my narrative during the Dust Bowl with the Soil Conservation Service, who's been tasked with revegetating the Great Plains and stopping wind erosion. And it's not as if erosion isn't happening in the upper Midwest. It's just not this wind erosion on the arid West where the farming practices implemented stood no chance, right? That's one of the wind erosion and the dust storms is really what you know it makes for a good picture, like you can see here. Um, and these are from that documentary, The Plow That Broke the Plains, that came out during the Dust Bowl. And I have a quote here from Hannah Hallman. It's a great book on the Dust Bowl called Dust Bowls of Empire. Quote, the soil of these rich ecologies, necessary to support every terrestrial living creature, including humans, was shorn of its protective layer, and the landscape was flattened to make way for the desolate monoculture of capitalist agriculture. Many lives were simply discarded and displaced to make way for the global land grab from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. The areas impacted and the lives mutilated were sacrifices. The worship gods were capital and profit. End quote. Yeah, great resource if you want to get deeper into it. You can take a drink of water as I talk a million miles an hour. So, what was the response? Federal response. So, one of the responses was to get cover back on those plowed up areas and quickly. So some of the earliest efforts to revegetate the high plains, they were utilizing native plant species. I mentioned Weaver earlier. He's doing a lot of work at this time, and one of the things he noted is in 1934, 1935 is, oh, the brome, the invasive grass is dead, and the Indian grass and big blue stem is still somewhat alive. So that's one of the reasons why it's utilized in the first place as well. It's available. Some ranchers, there's more of certainly more than like Iowa, Minnesota are, tall, act true tall grass area. Using native grasses for hay and forage was much more common at the time. Um, but Hugh Hammond Bennett, I'm sure you've heard his name before. He was pivotal in securing funds for the Great Plains, starting the Soil Conservation Service, being its first director, famously speaking in front of Congress during a session as dust storms moved in on Washington, D.C., sort of this mythical figure for the Soil Conservation Service. Quote, he said, quote, the growing and harvesting of native grass seed may become an important part of the cropping plans and work on some farms. That's promising. They establish a bunch of nurseries, and a lot of it's trees. They're growing a bunch of stuff, right? These shelter belts are really important to stopping wind erosion, that sort of thing, especially in areas where they'll continue to row crop, right? It's not total reconversion by any means. Um, but the Soil Conservation Service isn't just concerned with what's sufficient, right? They didn't sit down and were in the mindset where this was prairie, let's put prairie back. They're concerned with how can we fix this mess as fast as possible, where the people who live here won't shoot us, essentially, although they're pretty welcome as desperate out there. Um, and what's the most efficient way to do this? What's the most efficient plant to do this? There's a great publication by M.M. Hoover called Quantity Production Nurseries. I'll have some pictures from it from 1937. Quote, only when the growth habits and the erosion resistant properties of grass are known can the best use be made of that grass, whether it be planted on range or pasture, on eroded abandoned areas of the farm, or in contour strips in cultivated fields. End quote. Interesting to see prairie strips talked about in 1937. Probably a good idea to keep prairie on your field in some regard, or just perennial cover, but you can see a pretty quick preference for non-natives. Now, think about it from their perspective, how many, hundreds of years of, basically European farming is brought over to the US, right? And we want Timothy hay and ooh, brome looks great. So these sort of improved grasses are what they're used to. There's a lot of, and I use the word culture, but really what I mean is people can use it, like the culture of actually harvesting it, planting it, cultivating. They know how it acts. They're very used to certain plants and not others, and that's a problem because it leads to them not using native plants essentially in a lot of ways. So um, another quote here, and there's a recognition that they really are better adapted and better suited, certainly from an ecological standpoint. Another Weaver study, he put a hose into different grasses and basically poured water on them until they eroded more or less. And the non-natives usually did poorly, and natives did well. And then he did big blue stem. He's like, I can't get this to erode. So there's a recognition it's better, but it doesn't go that way for a variety of reasons. Another quote here from 43 kind of demonstrating that quote, the native vegetation has proved to be the best adapted to Midwest Kansas and should therefore be used for reestablishing depleted areas. But he goes on to say in that report about conditions of growing and learning about it. These conditions have presented many problems for research men. So one of the issues is they're so far behind on how to actually work with it. It makes it tough in the face. This absolute crisis comes about, there's no slow approach, right? So it's a bit tragic. And I love this picture on the far left. There's so much creativity in this time, so much ideas that you kind of wish stuck around, right? It's a probably can't maybe you can read it, but it's a hand operated like duster they converted to put seed out when it was really windy. You can't broadcast seed when it's super windy. So that's cool. How to establish grass as quickly as possible. They'll like do some plugs essentially. They did sod, put it sod down. They're obsessed with buffalo grass. They can never quite figure it out. Cleaning seed is always a problem. Just collecting it. You often read about Indian grass or blue stem where, yeah, one week it wasn't ready, and the next week it completely fell off, and we didn't get any. So all those issues with that, led to where we are now. And M.M. Hoover's name is Max Manley Hoover. I looked up, and that's just a cool name. Uh, yeah, and just some more pictures from that publication. I'm always struck by how similar, I shouldn't use that word, I can't say it, how like we do it today, some of the equipment is, and kind of the retrofitting is fascinating. So where the focus becomes, even on native plants, is developing and let's find the best native, right? and then let's develop it and we'll make a cultivar. So these cultivars often have names about where they're from. A good example is Blackwell switchgrass. Switchgrass is a native plant, is harvested in 1934, and then they compared it to their accessions of their plants. And then, all right, we're gonna release it and people will grow it in a monoculture. And that's also important to note that the focus will be monocultures for hay and cattle, right? And then overall, the SCS shifted its focus and they created plant material centers, which are still around today. They reduced the number. So let me slow down. The nurseries turned into plant material centers, but only a few of them, right? You can look in the map and see the ones that are left. Manhattan, Kansas, Bismarck, North Dakota. There's one in the Panhandle. Um, Albertson, is that what it is? Missouri, I think, is their closest one. But they're still around, still doing cultivars, doing good work, and they do other stuff as well. Um, uh, Quote, only 10 nurseries remained in 1954, and their role was changed from large-scale production to systematic evaluation and selection of superior strains of plants for specific conservation problems. The SCS can encourage commercial seed growers to produce the seeds and plants of these superior varieties, end quote. So in comes more room for the native plant industry that we'll see. And there are people certainly out there during the 50s, even while the Soil Conservation Service was growing more bulk seed, selling it for forage and stuff like that. There is, for a short period of time, it's somewhat similar to our modern day conservation reserve program. It was called the Soil Bank. Um, for many reasons, it shut down quickly. It cost an absolute buttload of money. And at least back then, there's a lot of factionalism between the Corn Belt and the South with cotton growers and all the parity stuff. We don't have time to get into it, but it got shut down and it left some people supplying that industry high and dry without the federal investment. Don Hajar from a CRP symposium many years later said, quote, many of these companies that were involved in the native plant seed industry during the soil bank had to turn to other products to stay in business. The native plant seed industry could not rely on agriculture as a marketing outlet for native grass seed. So there really is a 30-year gap between the federal government really being heavily involved from a demand side of the seed industry. And just more stuff. This is from 1967. It's a publication about how to do native grass seed. So there's still stuff out there about it. Again, I just like the pictures. I think they're cool to see the equipment they're trying to use. Pretty much all these pictures are from you probably can't see it, Oklahoma and the Panhandle as well. So let's jump back a little bit, but let's go to the Upper Midwest and talk a little bit about early restoration ecology. And the Curtis Prairie is a great example of this, where um, the research is being conducted. A lot is learned from that. It lays the groundwork. Allo Leopold is involved. I believe he's second from the right in that picture. Reseeding an area after a burn. They're hand collecting seed. It's intense. So pretty much everything's from local places. Um, But, in terms of federal investment, there is a triple C camp close by or worked a lot with it. So, um, hand uh, using buckets of water to water transplants by hand. I've done a little bit of myself, but it's really intense work. That's investment in prairie restoration, if there is anything. Um, and it's always interesting to see the seeds that they're using back then. Familiar faces, my dear rattlesnake master, I love. I just was at a remnant down here in Texas that had some, which is quite rare down here, and I was like, oh my God, yes. Um, uh, we're not going to dive too deep on restoration ecology history, but this book is a great resource to learn more. And these two quotes have really helped me think about what it is and kind of my research as well. Quote, ecological restoration challenges the idea that a place is either untamed or managed, wild or designed. And then, quote, recognition that society and nature are so pervasively intertwined that ecological thriving will always depend on active management, end quote. And I think it kind of stems back to that title I gave. It's persistence of both the plants themselves and the people. Like it's the same thing now. We both rely on each other. It's the destruction, and it's our responsibility to help restore it. Jumping ahead to the 60s, and I think the North American Prairie Conference is a great um, snapshot into this evolving restoration ecology. How do we restore the prairie type of decisions? And it relates to people who actually end up getting seed into the market that we buy today. So the first one happened in 1968, and one of the chief concerns of those initial meetings was the availability of local seed, not just, and then species availability and a lack of local seed to purchase. So you couldn't be like, hey, I'm planting 20 acres in central Illinois. I need 40 pounds of big blue stem. That just wasn't available. But folks would get on the phone. Where is this available? Oh, it's where all the investment and some of the remaining vegetation is in central Nebraska. So call them up, get a shipment, and plant that. There's problems with that, both, somewhat good and somewhat bad. Maybe you get some seed that does really well. Oh, it did really well. And now that's all it is. And that's not the goal of a prairie restoration, right? You want more diversity. Or I want more forbs and wildflowers, but I can't get them. Or they just don't germinate at all and you're out of luck. So, and then here's an example of a seed mix used in 1965. I think it's really cool. Rattlesnake Master again, some familiar faces. Compass plant you see out there today too. Obviously purple coneflower. Um, although, yeah. Uh, so talking about this sort of matrix and how there's a lot of interrelationships and crossover between scientists and researchers at the North American Prairie Conference, but also people are like, man, people were talking about, I need native seed, I need native seed. Like, well, I like prairie. I want to grow prairie. I want to sell seed. So people are inspired to do so. I think a great example of this, and they have a direct connection, is Windriff Nursery, started by Dot and Doug Wade. In 1970, they bought a remnant and then they basically proliferated it. And they studied under Leopold and helped at Curtis Prairie. So it's very directly connected to all this. And eventually, their son, Alan, you can see there, opened his own native seed business out of the living room in an intentional community. So there's also connections to like, environmentalism and back to the land movement and stuff like that in Minnesota. And Prairie Moon is still around today. So these links to the past are often direct. Maybe not, some aren't, but some are. And it's just cool to see. And one way I've come to think about the native seed industry is sort of this triangle, this convergence of it's a business, right? You can't grow and give away a bunch of seed. You're not going to succeed for a while unless it's like instead of buying a yacht, you buy a remnant prairie and restore it and give free seed, which would be great. And then, like I mentioned, that land ethic. I know Leopold is still in the left corner of the room. Environmentalism, for whatever you want to, give to that word, or conservation, whatever word you want to give it. And then this science and restoration ecology, or just boots on the ground. You don't have to be a scientist to go collect some native seed by hand and like, I don't know, pour some bleach on it, see if it works. That's probably greenhouse science stuff. But a part of it is just learning and being close to them, these plants, and just, kind of figuring out their personalities in some way, right? I think that's a part of it that is really cool. And I guess you get that somewhat, and you could get that somewhat growing corn and stuff, but there's not the variety, right? And that's one thing that I should have included is just the absolute variety in the actual physical seed is huge. Like tiny, tiny little milkweed, like there's vacuum, like trays you can get to actually plant them into plugs. And then you have big old honking compass plants, which are still, smaller than corn, but I shouldn't dwell on this too long. Um, what do we got here? Oh, and this is another North American Prairie Conference, just kind of seed list. And it's really an example of how hard it is to actually get seed onto the market. Basically, they're laying out best case scenario. It takes us 3 years to collect something, plant it, figure out how to plant it. Did it fail? Harvest it, and then basically get it to a large enough level where I can, even if it's just a little packet, I can sell to somebody. So It's very involved. And this grower was from California, which was cool. And there's some interesting plants on there. And then, um, and this is some just research from APMC, the one in Manhattan, Kansas, Plant Material Center. So, um, there's people working for the federal government, state governments, kind of conservation boards. The North American Prairie Conference is I think, very important to, you know, at, it's a lens for a historian to go and look at, the change over time and the history of it. But it's also where people share and exchange ideas and that kind of stuff and see the interconnectedness. All right, moving more on to CRP. So, CRP came from the Food Security Act of 1985, what we call the Modern Farm Bill. Um, it's called the Modern Farm Bill because basically every amendment, every change to our conservation policy and farming is an amendment to that, right? So it's really important. Um, and another resource I highly recommend is Jonathan Coppice. This book is recent. That's more specific about conservation. He has one more generally about Farm Bill policy history. They're both very good. He's at Illinois for Farm Doc Daily. Recommend if you want to learn more. I'm always surprised when I don't see him cited in anything related to this, and it blows my mind. Um, and a quote from that quote, the Landmark Food Security Act of 1985 created a new foundation for agricultural conservation policy. It went beyond the traditional policy of paying farmers and landowners to simply retire land from production to include conservation efforts on active or working lands. Working lands is important here, active is important. It also introduced conservation compliance. So I'm sure you've heard of sod buster and swamp buster, and to basically receive the real ice cream cone stuff like crop insurance subsidies and stuff, you would need to have a conservation plan on your farm. So this is very, very important in a major shift. Um, and from his work, he has another interesting way of looking at how policies shift over time called path dependency. Quote, each step is determined in some parts by the steps that preceded it, end quote. It's very simple, but I think it's important to keep in mind in terms of I'm not really going to give policy recommendations here. That's not my role. But any policy change to get us to a better spot, conservation wise, prairie restoration wise, will really need to it won't come out of thin air, right? It needs to come from something existing. And we'll see that. We'll talk about that a little bit more with CRP, the NRCS, and then a little bit on roadsides. So getting in the 80s here, the farm crisis arrives, CRP gets passed, and the native seed industry is growing. The country's reeling from the Nixon and Reagan administration's energy and farm policies. In a nutshell, I'm sure many are familiar. In the 70s, they said farm fence row to fence row. We're gonna start selling to the Soviet Union again. People make a bunch of money, environmental degradation goes way up, and then eventually the floor falls out. And you get the farm crisis where, again, all this is way more complicated than I'm making it, obviously, but more or less, you wake up one day and if you owed a bunch of money on land or equipment, everything had depreciated. So you had a much bigger mortgage than the bank coming out. They'll total everything up. Oh, all your equipment and land is worth like say $100, but you owe us 500. So that leads to bankruptcies and a whole bunch of bad stuff and just overall uh, poor economy, especially in Iowa then. And as we mentioned, the CRP comes around and it's leveraging, as we've discussed, an already existing native seed industry built on rural entrepreneurship. I don't think it's often seen that way, but that's exactly what it is. Restoration ecology, the science behind it, been going on for about 50 years then. There's probably deeper history to it than that, but that's really important too. Um, they could have passed CRP and then be like, we don't know how to plant it. They knew how to plant it. Um, and then, the small group of folks who are like, ecosystem restoration could lead to a better future. That business side of it, let's try and sell some seed. And this massive influx of demand did lead to a rise in grass prices for sure. Grass supply dries up. So one important thing to read, and if you look through a lot of this sources, is they're really talking about brome or timothy, the stuff they're familiar with. Once again, we come up with that And they want to plant the non-native grasses. That's what they want. Eventually maybe they'll use it as pasture or whatever. And so it's partially an opportunity for people to get experience with natives. Now, it's very important to know this early version CRP, and even today, they're not really prairie restoration. I think we could get into it's a whole topic, right? So CP1 and CP2. CP1 was non-native grasses, CP2 was native grasses, and it was in pretty much every case switchgrass. So monoculture is a switchgrass, just to give you an idea of what's happening here. So, but it's an opportunity for seed growers to come out and join this, burgeoning opportunity. I know there's several seed growers you're probably familiar with that came around at this time. Some of them growing sod, so like Allendale Seed Company, they started selling native seed before the CRP, but there's also the roadside stuff we'll mention a little bit, and then Shooting Star Native Seed Nursery comes to mind. Um, Hoxie Native Seed. They if I hope I'm not butchering the story, but I believe Carol, one of the founders of the founder, found a remnant patch that was left fallow and was like, well, let's give this a shot. And I find that sort of thing inspiring because it's so different than kind of what I'm used to, and there's a lot of cultural baggage to trying something new like that. I think it's cool. Um, so I mentioned roadsides a little bit. I'll talk about it for a minute here. Um, Mostly because I just adore this picture that looks terrible on screen. There is a physical copy somewhere in the TPC building. So this is Bill Haywood. He worked for the County Conservation Board. He was tasked with basically blanket spraying. I say blanket spraying the roadsides to keep down invasives, to keep the farmers happy. Um, and he's done this a couple years, and he's like, I'm sick of this, and there has to be a better way. And that's one of the beautiful things is, how we even get the industry, how we get prairie on the ground is experience like this, right? So we went to the conservation board and said, hey, I want to try plant some native prairie instead of this. And, from there, eventually skip a lot of hoops and stuff. And there's a deeper history to the Living Roadway Trust Fund, and what makes Iowa a leader in planting roadways to prairie is that program. In other states, we're doing so at the state level, similar IRVM practices, but Iowa passed a 15% premium for locally sourced native seed. So if I'm growing native sod, all of a sudden there's a huge incentive. No, I'm growing like non-native grasses. I'm growing Bermuda grass. I see this major incentive for a state agency. This is less risk for you to try it and higher profit margins if you succeed. So that's like a small state legislation thing. It was a big deal to get passed. But those small legislative things can snowball into much bigger success, right? And that's sort of that path dependency I'm talking about. And I also don't want to underestimate some of that path dependency is just people on the ground who want to do something. They're in the right place at the right time with some levers of influence and power. So, um, Christine Nimmick had this history written about the roadside. I recommend going and reading if you want to learn more. I don't want to butcher it more than I probably already have. Um, I'm not sure if they're really easy to get to, but there's oral histories Gene Eels conducted that are really awesome. That Bill Hillerwood's in there, and I'll share a quote from Steve Holland, who's the LRTF coordinator. Quote, problem then was the only seed available came from Texas or Kansas, and it didn't grow sustainably. As we developed the source identified seeds, it started making a difference, end quote. Um, an example that's coming to mind is the Story County roadside guy, Joe Koiker. I talked to him once, and he said, yeah, I planted a bunch of Maximilian sunflowers from Nebraska, and now that ditch is just all that, and it still is. So there's consequences not using adapted seed, right, down the line. And then from the federal level, like these administrative executive orders, they have consequences too, even though maybe that wasn't the original intent. In 1994, they basically defined native and non-native, which hadn't happened on the federal level before, at least for the roadsides and stuff, and added an incentive. which helped down the line. Ernst Native Seed Company comes to mind. Somebody who took advantage of this, as well as like the federal highway, uh, the Eisenhower interstate system. Anyway, stuff like that. So small things can be leveraged into bigger things is kind of my point here. And then here's just some definitions. So going back to the NRCS, by the 90s, the Soil Conservation Service had changed its name to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I think it offered an opportunity to expand and change the mission of the agency, even though it was really tied to the Clinton administration's reorganization of the government, balancing the budget and all that. But it was an opportunity. Paul Johnson, who we'll learn more about at Kurt Miney's talk, and so I hope everyone signs up for that. He wrote he wrote a publication called A Geography of Hope. He's um, using Wallace Stegner's writing. He wrote The Wilderness. Excuse me. Let me take a drink. Uh, he penned the Wilderness Act, and so basically, Paul's like, let's apply this to private lands, to working lands. And it's a lens of the structural and cultural shift. Quote, on behalf of the American people, the NRCS undertakes the challenge of reading the land. Um, so, just cool stuff. Recommend reading that too. Going to the talk. And then, example of this. So what does that actually mean? What action came from something like this? Well, one thing, the 1996 Farm Bill explicitly modified the Environmental Benefits Index. It's called the EBI. In a nutshell, it's the criteria in which, I'm Farmer John. I go to the office. I say, I want to enroll this. And they'll write out and they'll put it against the criteria and you're ranked against other people. So it's important. Um, and then they modified it to include wildlife benefits for land enrollment. So I want to plant some prairie goes, looks pretty good. Now it's just, 1 or 2 points on a large scale where erodibility is the biggest factor, but still. And then also want to point out states play a pivotal role in actual programmatic specifications and outcomes, and marketing is one way to put it. Um, and there can be quite a difference between states. For example, one state may require a different seeding rate. Like I'm going to sign up for a CRP. Um, Illinois has a lower seeding rate than Iowa. That leads to different outcomes. So decisions like that, which are often very opaque, are really important. So the people at these levels in the state office and their local county office are really important. Again, sort of the people part of dependence is really important, and also like we should be grateful to a lot of the work that these federal workers have done over time. And obviously, in today's environment, that's not happening very much, at least maybe from their boss. But let's not dwell on that. Uh, and then just these clips, they were, I just thought they're cute. Just the ideas behind it, like a prairie chicken coming from the SCS, it is cool to see. It's a cultural shift. It's slow. It's certainly, even today, we're far from where we need to be, but it's happening, and it's because of people, right? It's because of people wanting to change how things are done in the face of, the Goliath of industry and agriculture and all those things. Um, love this example of sort of that interconnection between, people who are passionate and working for the government or work for the government and kind of get into the native seed industry. The Ion Exchange out of Alamance County. Howard and Donna Bright, they started it in I think the late 80s, and they felt they could make a bigger impact working in the private native seed industry than they could working for the SCS at the time. Quote, we would spend days driving and collecting by hand these natives. We would provide people with the opportunity to bring back this natural world of beauty. Their website's up and they have cute videos. It's really, really cool. And they were very much leaders and still are in getting we're going to go hand collect the seed. Let's get it on the market so somebody can actually buy it. And one of the ways demand was increased, so you could actually do this, is CP25. It's a practice for CRP called rare and declining habitat. It's rolled out in the 90s. Also reflects that larger conservation focus. And basically, we're going to do more with less acres kind of over time. The caps have lowered. You start to see forbs and mixtures more often. My understanding this has led to pretty good habitat, at least in the early 2000s. And CRP is explicitly, by some people, being linked to prairie restoration. Um, from the USDA state conservationist Leroy Brown, end quote, many people elected to improve wildlife habitat by planting warm season grasses. Many also chose to go with a practice called rare and declining habitat, which will restore Iowa's native prairie. Now, that's very ambitious. And again, like the whole what is a prairie restoration? How do you actually restore it? That's the whole thing. But striving to it, having a more diverse plant community, certainly better than monoculture on a highly erodible hill. Just a snapshot of the impact of this. Another thing, Pheasants Forever. How are people actually interacting with the program? Eventually, we see farm bill biologists from Pheasants Forever and other organizations, Xerces Society, that sort of thing. They were started as a reaction in the late 70s as well, 80s to habitat loss and specifically pheasant loss. They passed an upland bird stamp, so another kind of definitely not a small thing, but maybe not exactly what you think of as transformative. Um, Legislation or whatever, and to keep pheasants around. And then they ended up having this Farm Bill biologist program, who are so important to, I'll say Farmer John again, coming in the office, and who's he going to meet? Oh, it's a Farm Bill biologist who wears a couple hats. They work at the USDA, NRCS, and their Pheasants Forever. Um, that's a great way to encourage. These are people who are like, yeah, good habitat is good quail habitat, and it's good for everybody. So it's important to keep in mind. Going to the later in the 2000s, the Obama administration spearheaded growing federal policy at helping pollinators, including bees and monarchs. There's a lot of obviously still doing with this now about colony collapse and monarch habitat, milkweed species, all that sort of stuff. So what emerged from this was how do we help them? Well, on working lands, we have this thing called CRP. Let's create a new practice that we will make sure the states implement and prioritize. And what came was the CP42 pollinator habitat. And one interesting thing is the specifications came from the feds for the most part, which is different. And it had, and again, it's the native seed industry serving as a safety valve for that commodity market, right? For issues with the commodity market. And we have this problem. How can we fix it? And well, we got some seed to try and plant. And one of the problems was there's a huge boom. Too way too much, too fast. It was kind of a perfect storm of commodity prices were suppressed, cash rents were going lower. Oh, I can sign up for this practice and get a nice per acre payment, better than I'm going to get over the next few years. Let's sign up. A lot of people did. And just it was too much too fast. And like I mentioned, a lot of people signed up, which is great. We want people to do that. Um, but when things like this happen and prices were high for a lot of things, which is a problem. It's maybe the only opportunity on this 40 acres that was had for the next 40 years to interact with the NRCS, with CRP, that sort of thing. So it can be a missed opportunity. One issue was some allegedly weed seed Palmer amaranth in the seed supply, which is not good. And I found this old forum. One seed and you'll be sorry you planted the CRP. So kind of high stakes. There's a lot of changes that have happened to make sure this doesn't happen and all that stuff. So yeah, too much too fast was bad for the industry. And the optics are really important. And yeah, here's some pollinator habitat that the TPC has planted in prairie strips. Just wanted to share that. Doing great work. So some takeaways. CRP leveraged an existing native seed industry and both developed together in a lot of ways. Federal policy relating to the seed industry is an investment in the environmental economic resilience of the upper Midwest and the country as a whole. And then practice specifications influence the market. There's no doubt in my mind from what I've seen is that there's room on the supply side, room for these growers with incentives and with sharing risk and all these sorts of things, they can absolutely supply the market with more seed and, basically higher quality plantings. We can do better than what we are, even though there's been a lot of work to get where what was once a monoculture of switchgrass to, all right, here's 20 seeds, we're going to plant them. We got 15 to come up. This looks great. It's kind of a lot of wood blue stem now, but there's still some forage for the monarchs on their way back down to Mexico. So that's really what it's all about. Uh, this image, I kept it in from a previous talk, and it's just so fitting, right? So before AI, before I fully understand the repercussions of AI that are coming for us all and the people who, well, let's not go there. But I typed in Midwest prairie, and this is what comes up. And I love it so much because this is the Midwest without prairie. It's an abandoned late, 1910s, 1920s farmhouse on ground that they're going to take the time to destroy the house. We'll just farm all the way around it. And I find that inspirational. I find the people who have worked and advocated for and grown seed and collected seed, it's the antithesis to apathy. Like we can do something about it, and people have been doing it for over 100 years. And I encourage anybody here with the ability to advocate for prairie restoration, advocate for native seed, locally genetic seed, um, appreciate the people involved in the process, whether they're growers or people at your NRCS office or, you know, maybe even your politician. We'll see what they're up to. But I think it's inspirational. And one last quote I want to share with you is from Joyce Powers. Uh, uh, she grew a native seed business in Mount Harab, Wisconsin. I think it's Wisconsin. Quote, if people can make a fortune destroying the environment, but you can't make a decent living restoring it, then it doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Andy, you want to take some questions?
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, I should have said that. And I can scroll through any slides if people want to see them.
Sure. Yeah. Now we have some questions from online, and then we might have some questions from the room. So Mallory, do you want to?
Yeah, I can start with a couple of the comments and questions from online. The first one we received was about halfway through your presentation, and it asked how many native plant initiatives are active now.
Oh, that's a great question. I have no idea. You mean from a, state or every level? I think that's a hard question to answer. That's probably not satisfying to hear.
Okay. Another question, which I think can be resolved later too, is that they're asking for a list of books that you've suggested throughout your talk. So
Yep. I can
I can follow up.
you cut out a little bit, but yeah, I can clean up my presentation, add those as like a works cited because yeah, they're important. I always appreciate that one. I get those. That's why I include them in there.
Okay, and the last question that we have in the chat as of now is, what has been the Indigenous involvement in these efforts?
Mm. So that is, I mean, this will sound like cop out. This is outside the scope of what I've looked at. I know it's been much larger efforts in the western half of the United States, um, because a lot of the reservations are out there. And then just from a history perspective, I did not include any like that's the word, ethnobotany in my research. There's absolutely stuff out there that I wish people could study, but I haven't looked at it very explicitly. I'm trying to think of what the indigenous seed savers. I don't want to butcher the names for people, so I don't want to just start guessing. But there's definitely at least one BLM uh, program going on with that.
It looks like there have been some resources added to the chat. www.nativeseeds.org may be able to answer that question. There's a lot of praise for your presentation. Everyone's saying thank you and they appreciate your talk. There was a question if you could scroll back to the Hannah Holloman quote.
Yeah. There we go.
Wonderful. Are there questions from the room?
Andy, could you talk a little bit about the origin of this study? Why we conducted it? It was part of a larger project, and maybe it'd be interesting for some people to know kind of how this question evolved of, why attack this particular question?
Gotcha. And well, I think Laura, you're probably better positioned to answer this than me, but I'll give it a short shot. But yeah, it's part of a Farm Service Agency grant that is looking at, basically seed availability. And one of the questions that's important to that is, how did we get to where we are? You can only have actual seed mix data, which is really, in my opinion, like the golden goose of the study, and Dr. Meissen and others have worked a lot on that. And but like what's the background? How did we get to where we're at? And hopefully somewhat influence where we're going. But I never promised that with history. I don't know. We're always fools and we always repeat our mistakes just in slightly different ways. But yeah, for me, that's really the central question, and really thinking about and why there's a lot of CRP talk in here is how has federal policy. I think sort of the original question was, did CRP make the native seed industry? And the answer is no. Certainly, it added a lot of more opportunity to expand it, but from terms of like availability and people out there doing it, no, even though they're interconnected. Um, yeah, is that Laura? You go ahead and further explain it.
Uh, that's a good summary. It makes me wonder, if there never been a CRP program to kind of spur demand for native seed, and if it was just relying on a few botany nerds and prairie lovers in our backyards and little patches here and there, would there even be enough, demand for native seed to have seed companies produce that for us?
That's a great question, and I would like to believe that states would have ended up taking a bigger role in agriculture specifically, had that not happened. I can't think of the name of the program, but effectively Minnesota started like a mini CRP and Illinois before the federal programs started. So I think probably the scale of it's smaller, but at least some states would have taken the lead, as we've seen in roadsides. That's kind of my, what if sort of question. And what happens to farm policy without land retirement programs? And the answer is probably pretty ugly. Certainly from a erosion standpoint and all that stuff. So if don't pass the CRP in 85, probably more drastic problems arise and something maybe even better, but too late comes around federally. But it's also hard to say.
Andy, can you scroll back to a slide in your presentation where you showed there was an orchid listed on one of the first seed mixes potentially that you showed?
This one? Oh, I don't think
Valerie, did you,
so.
his picture over to the left
Yeah.
side? What was that?
Oh, it was this one?
Mm,
Oh,
It was on that first one. There was a first one that you showed us.
this one?
There, Habenaria.
Oh, they got it.
Okay.
Yeah, the Havenaria, did they actually plant Havenaria?
Yeah,
Yeah, wow.
they transplanted it. Yeah,
Transplant.
I think they dug these up and transplanted them,
Ooh.
which another labor intensive activity as someone who just did some gamma grass transplanting. Orchid's probably tougher, I'll be honest.
There is another question in the chat. Any info or thoughts on purchasing seed from local ecosystems for best results for specific areas?
Ooh, um, talk to Dr. Justin Myson. No. Well, we have a native seed calculator. Well, not we anymore. Sorry. Talker's Prairie a native seed calculator is a good spot. And also just going directly to the seed growers themselves. They'll have information on where things are from. Laura Walter has a lot of resources on our website as well. I feel like I'm butchering this answer. If Laura, you want to provide a better answer? I haven't put on my Prairie on Farms hat in a while. I'm nervous.
Well, we are really lucky in Iowa that we do have access to Iowa source seed that was collected originally from remnant prairies in Iowa. And so that's really different than it was in 1989 when the roadside program started. And the only place to get those seeds was from Kansas or Nebraska. Or if you wanted Blazing Star seed, you had to get it from the Netherlands because they were growing it as a cut flower. So things have really changed, but it's not like this in all parts of the country. There's a lot of places where you do not have that choice, as much choice for a species or the genetic diversity or the origin of it. I don't know if that answers their maybe answer. How about some folks in the room? Yeah.
Is the future of CRP in jeopardy?
Yeah, I think everything at the federal level is on possibly in jeopardy. Um, I it could be there's no real leadership on Farm Bill talks. There hasn't been since it was up for renewal under Biden, and there's certainly none now other than I will say though, in general, even the big ag lobby groups like the Farm Bureau, they don't want to see CRP entirely go away. I think the biggest concern would be the acreage cap gets lowered to like 15 million. I forget the latest number that got thrown out. Or more drastically, and which is what I'm most worried about, and this is Farm Bill kind of nerd stuff, but the separation of sort of this triangle of the ag commodities, the conservation, and then at the bottom the SNAP, like the programs that are used by far, far more parts of the population. It's why it works the way it does. It's created a coalition in Congress that doesn't seem to be performing well or talking to each other. So yeah, I think absolutely we should be worried about the CRP program. Not as if I know something about it. I'm not in Washington, and quite frankly, I don't think they know on any given day what's going to happen. But yeah, I would, and again, I would advocate. I would contact your local political office, and that's not a satisfying answer either, but um, that's where we're at, and just one thing you see a lot, and this isn't super pertinent to your question, is that if you think your local NRCS office or your state conservationist or whatever is doing a good job, um, let people know about it, advocate for them. Oftentimes they're otherized and they're seen as, I mean, I'm not going to say they're not seen as human, but it's more seen as, oh, that's the feds, that's the state. There's people behind there doing a lot of really good work. And I know this is, work funded by the FSA, but I genuinely feel that way. And especially in today's climate, it's important that we, stand with people like that. I just want to throw that out there and makes me sad some of the comments that come out about, bureaucrats and stuff, but not to go too far about that. Did that answer your question about
There's
CRP?
another follow-up question.
Well, and I just heard a public radio piece about solar panels. And has
No.
there been some move to move CRP ground and solar panels together? Have you heard anything about that? Is there any of that going on?
I have not. I mean, it's the antithesis to the program as it's been. And again, back to the original idea is land retirement, and putting a solar panel on 8 acres of ground is certainly not retirement. And there's a whole other suite of issues with, actually having functional prairie under there. So I hope not, but I don't know.
Another question here?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with wetlands and the difference in species. Is there seed efforts for along wetlands? And correspondingly, is there any money or funding in restoring wetlands themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. And I made a choice to not really look at wetlands too much because they're different, and a lot of those companies are more centered in the Great Lakes region. It seems from not looking into it too much. And then in terms of money, yeah, I think there really seems to be more private dollars in wetland restoration. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but in the Upper Midwest, maybe not so much. I That's not a satisfying answer, but yeah, that's what I got. There's different federal programs that are linked with CRP or with, I forget the name of what's CREP or whatever. I think that involves wetlands. So there are programs out there um, dealing with that, but I'm far less familiar with them.
Another question here.
Yeah, they're trying to do away with CRP. But I have 73 acres. I've been fighting with them over a year on. I went and put it into CP 42, expensive flowers and everything, and I really thought that that was a good plan. And when the 10 years was up, it would re-enroll without anything to do with it. Now they're telling me, no, I can only have 7 acres into the CP 42. I gotta plow up the other part of it, redo it. I gotta put a food plot on it and everything. It's gonna cost me a lot of money. They took $50 an acre away from me, and plus I gotta redo it. It's looking like I'm not gonna redo it. I re-put it in again because I wanna put it in. If they let me leave it alone, I'd take a $50 cut. But I gotta spend the money and redo it.
hmm Yeah, I understand your
have that.
frustration. It's been, um, again, part of it stems from, the program exploding, right? And so many people signed up, and the money isn't there at the state level or the federal level for funds. So it's programmatic balancing work, and yeah, I'm sorry that's happening to you. And I'm guessing
Also,
they think part of it is not meeting the standards of the program. I don't know if that's true, but I don't have too much advice, but I would encourage you to at least enroll some of it or whatever. Right? It's a challenging situation. And I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you.
if they would leave it alone, it sounds like they're thinking our butterflies, we got too much pollinator and they want me to get rid of some of it. I mean, say that it's, let me leave my pollinator alone. What they will.
No,
I have to redo.
we're hearing that from, I heard that from a farm bill biologist who said, yeah, they're starting. Some counties are saying you have to do this, other counties are saying that. And they're all kind of, different and they haven't kind of come together. But I think there might be something that would satisfy them that would be short of tearing everything. Because a lot of them don't really want to do that either. A lot of those folks are really pro prairie, but the way they're reading the new regulations, they feel like that's what they have to tell you.
I'd like to cheat on it and just leave it alone and see what they would say.
Yeah,
They might throw me out. It's hard on keeping the trees on. It's a night,
How long has it been in the program?
10 years.
10 years, okay.
yeah. There's a lot of people in your shoes, and we'll put you in touch with some people who are with another. Well, it's with Pheasants Forever, kind of it's well, it's Allie Barth is who I'm thinking. She was telling me about this, and she manages several counties worth of farm bill biologists. So she had some ideas for ways to do it that didn't require tearing it all up. So we'll try to connect you with somebody that could maybe make it, maybe.
I
Make it,
think honestly, they've got
Is that-
seals and.
yeah, yeah.
They gotta go by the rules and.
Yeah, and one of the frustrations, or one of the, well, I should say, one of the ways that we hope that Tallgrass Prairie hopes to contribute is that, there's not a lot of, NRCS isn't a scientific agency.
No.
They don't do research, they don't know how to do research, and they make recommendations kind of seat of the pants sometimes. And we try to provide some scientific backing and knowledge to help make them better programs. Yeah.
We're getting close to time. So one more question. Sort of maybe thinking more aspirationally. What next for the native seed market? Where does it grow from here? Where does it go from here?
Yeah, I think it's a good question for the businesses themselves. I mean, they're constantly trying to improve their methods and get new stuff on the market. You know, I probably some lean years in terms of, certainly federal policy, federal improvement. There, I really think that there's so much room to grow. Laura mentioned they're not science, a lot of people like go and, I want to install pollinator habitat. They'll give you kind of this seed mix, and how much that person actually knows about that can vary extremely widely. And I think there's a lot of education and training, or just, especially from somebody researching it, how do we make it easier for people to make more functional, better, but not necessarily way more expensive mixes by, well, this is really expensive right now. Let's swap it down, or I think there's a lot of room from that perspective to change. Um, and then just generally, I mean, fundamentally, it'd be better if, uh, how to put it, um, it's really, again, back to that cultural sort of aspect of it is, and this is not a satisfying answer at all, is can we get more people to do it without as much of an economic incentive, right? And I'm not talking enrolling 40 acres of field or anything. That's a whole different ballpark. I'm talking like, man, somebody recognizing this acre doesn't give me any money any year. It's like half an acre. What can we do differently? And they just kind of go and do it. Again, I'm trying to speak practically. Now, what's my wackadoodle answer to this? It's some crazy like land tenure program that, and like, we use a stick, and 10% of the state is converted to prairie. There's crazy things that can happen. Obviously, that's not going to happen. That's insane. But I guess that's my best answer. Because I'm a pessimistic person at heart. Not to, if you haven't noticed, I am not always super hopeful about the future, but
People will admit that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Andy. We just have a couple wrap up things to touch on here, and then we'll let y'all go.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Andy, for that wonderful presentation.
thanks everybody, and we'll see if Laura lets me talk at the TPC ever again. But thank you, everybody.
Of course, we will command you again. Before we conclude, I'd like to draw your attention to some upcoming events. Continuing the seminar series, pretty quickly on March 10th, we have a famous historian, environmental historian, a biographer of Aldo Leopold, who's at the Aldo Leopold Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Kurt Miney will be giving a presentation about Aldo Leopold, Paul Johnson, and a land ethic for Iowa and beyond. It's a wonderful book. It's a book of Paul Johnson's writings that he's pulled together with some explanations of the context for these writings. And Paul Johnson was very, very important in the whole history of prairie restoration and even the roadside program in the state, and served as director of the NRCS when it first became the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And then on April 21st, we'll have a a screening of the film America's Lost Landscape, Tallgrass Prairie, which came out in 2002 and was done by Daryl Smith and others here at the university, along with a panel of UNI alumni, or we like to call them Prairie Panthers. So those are coming up, and we'll also have a prescribed burn season, and you're looking at the volunteer coordinator here, Ethan, who's in very capable hands, coordinating all the different burns that we have to have enough people to help. And so if you're interested in that, we have information on our website and coming out soon. And then also we will be doing a series of wildflower walks again this year at Urban Prairie, which is near Dysart, Iowa. It's a beautiful prairie that's will be almost 300 acres when it's finished. And we're doing quite a few more than we did last year. So that will also be on our website. And we'll also be doing an open house in June, right around the solstice. So please join us if you can. And thank you so much for coming, and thank everyone online. Thanks again.